Today marks the day of the Normandy landings, also known as D-Day, or in some cases also known as Operation Overlord. D-Day marked the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime, which unfortunately didn't come to an end until a year later. On the 6th of June 1944, British and Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. But this had been a long time in the making. For you see, civilians back in Britain had been working tirelessly to make sure that this day would be the day that would form victory for Europe. This was done by weather reporters, code breakers, and everybody else that worked to make sure that we had the machinery, the weaponry, and everything else that we needed in order for this invasion to take place. Everything they did was to make sure that this invasion would be the perfect invasion, or as perfect as warfare can be. D-Day was a highly ambitious amphibious landing intended to bring a speedy end to the war. The generals who decided on this particular invasion had taken into consideration all the previous invasions they'd done, from the ones they succeeded at to the ones that they didn't. And it's because of those victories and losses that they decided to make D-Day the ultimate invasion. But it took them a while to even decide on Normandy. They were looking up and down the coast to figure out where was the best location to go. Some places, unfortunately, were too close to German lines, but it would mean they would get to the heart of the invasion. But on the flip side, by doing so, it would also mean that the Germans would have an advantage. In some cases, they wanted to go as far as Norway, but Churchill remembered the events that happened in the First World War and the amount of losses that were lost, and they didn't want a repeat of that. So in the end, after much debating, they decided to launch their invasion on the Normandy beaches of France. Before D-Day happened, everybody was working around the clock. The invasion would go as smoothly as possible. People working in the factories making sure that we had tons of machinery, weaponry, vehicles. About 50,000 vehicles came out of Britain. We made tanks. We made jeeps. We made armoured cars. And not only did we do that, but we made sure that they were camouflaged. And we made sure that they would go to ports that would support our case. So they were there at the time of the invasion. In regards to the soldiers, a lot of American troops came to Britain and practiced on the beaches surrounding Britain in places like Dover and various other places like that in order to prepare for the Normandy landings. For the Normandy landings, it wasn't just battleships, it was everything. We had battleships, we had an air force, we had an army on the ground. We had to make sure that our soldiers could get off the ships and get straight to the beaches without having much to stop them. We wanted them to have as much support as possible. And we succeeded. Everything had to line up. Weather reports came in to make sure that the 6th of June would be the day that they would launch their invasion. As luck would have it, 2 days before the launch of Operation Overlord, the American troops managed to capture a German U-boat, and on that U-boat was an Enigma and the code book. If we had not been able to capture that, it may have been a 50-50 chance of how it would have gone down. But because we managed to capture this U-boat with an Enigma on it and the code book, we were able to use that code book to then understand what was going on within the Enigma and break the codes that were being sent out. The Enigma was thought to be something that was unbreakable according to the Germans. They didn't think anything of it. Although they changed it day after day, there was a system and people were starting to clock onto it. But what better than having the handbook in your hand to be able to identify what people were talking about? For obvious reasons, nobody was allowed to know this until after the invasion had happened, for obvious reasons. But the fact that that had fallen into their lap just 2 days prior to the invasion happening, it could have been seen as nothing more than a positive sign that they were on the right path and that they, the Allies, the British and everybody else, were going to win this war. and bring this war to an end. As preparations for Operation Overlord was being underway, a lot of things, unfortunately, made people start to panic. It was actually a bit of a surprise that the Germans didn't actually clock on that this was going on. For there was a German spy who knew that an invasion was going to happen, just didn't know when or where. They even had a diversion in Calais, which Hitler was so convinced was a genuine attack that a lot of his troops went there instead. Even after D-Day, he was still convinced that another attack was going to happen on those very beaches. At one point, there was a crossword that went out in the newspaper, and that crossword sent out an alarm to the military forces. For a lot of words that were used in that crossword were words that American and Canadian soldiers were very freely using, and that school children ended up using themselves to add to the crossword. So unknowingly, they unfortunately used those words and caused mass panic amongst the government. Sort of things should really have made the Germans be a bit more wary as to what was going on. But after their defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans were not in a position really to stretch themselves any thinner than they already were. On the 6th of June 1944, the invasion started. On a rather gloomy looking day, British and Allied troops marched onto the beaches, wading through the water in order to get to the beach, in order to make their mark. Although they managed to push the Germans back, progress was slow. Their equipment and their clothes were heavy from the water, and the snipers managed to pick them off one by one. If it wasn't the snipers, then it was mines that was already on the beach. And if it wasn't them, then it was the water itself that would take some of the men and drown them. Not a pretty sight at all. But although we encountered a lot of casualties and a lot of losses, it was nothing in comparison to previous invasions. And if anything, this invasion did mark the beginning of the end of the Second World War. On the evening of the 6th of June, Churchill addressed the House of the Commons. During the night and the early hours of this morning, the first of a series of landings in force upon the European continent has taken place. In this case, the liberating assault fell on France. So far, the comrades who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. And what a plan! This vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult that has ever taken place. There are already hopes that actual tactical surprise has been attained, and we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle that has now begun will grow constantly in scale and intensity for many weeks to come, and I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course. A moment in history that is forever remembered, and every year on the 6th of June, people gather in Normandy to remember their fallen comrades, or to remember the times that have gone by. For as with each passing year, more and more of the people that were there to witness the events go down are no longer with us. But this day was a powerful and important day. If you want to know more about the Normandy landings or D-Day or Operation Overlord, whichever word you want to use for it, I'd recommend checking out this magazine here. This issue is their special issue, marking 80 years since the D-Day landings. Thank you for watching.